The twin suns burned low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the settlement's metallic walkways. The air held the crisp scent of ionized minerals, a reminder that this world had once been barren rock before its people bent it to their will. Now, towering structures of chitin and steel clawed at the sky, a testament to the strength of the Vareth species. Strength above all else defined them, and for those who lacked it, there was no place. The Orphan knew this lesson well. Thin and underdeveloped, their carapace a dull gray where others gleamed with deep blues and greens, they moved through the streets with the careful silence of someone who had long learned to be invisible. Their secondary arms, meant for fine motor control, remained tucked against their torso, useless, stunted things. A defect at birth, a sign of weakness, a stain upon their bloodline. Their elders had refused to name them, for what was a name if not a promise of a future? They had no future. The market hummed with life, filled with the low reverberations of conversation, the sharp chittering of trades being struck, and the occasional bark of authority from enforcers patrolling the sector. The Orphan navigated through it with practiced ease, eyes locked on a stall where a merchant had momentarily turned their attention away from a crate of nutrient packs. Hunger gnawed at their gut, a dull, familiar ache. Just as they reached out, a rough hand clamped onto their wrist. "Thief." The voice was thick with disgust. The merchant, his exoskeleton a deep cobalt that marked high lineage, squeezed tighter, enough to make the Orphan's underdeveloped plating creak. Pathetic. The Orphan did not struggle. Struggling would only amuse him. Others were turning now, watching with detached interest. No one would interfere. No one ever did. Then a new voice, one that did not belong. "Hey, let them go." It was deep but smooth, edged with an accent the Orphan had never heard before. More importantly, it was speaking in standard trade tongue, not the guttural clicks of Vareth speech. The crowd parted slightly, revealing a figure that did not belong here. The human stood taller than most of the surrounding aliens, broad-shouldered and clad in what appeared to be worn, functional clothing, utility pants, a jacket too light for the cold, and boots scuffed with travel. Their face, lacking the hard plating of the Vareth, was bare and expressive, brows drawn low over sharp eyes that flicked between the merchant and the Orphan with something oddly close to concern. The merchant sneered. "This is not your affair, off-worlder." "It is now," the human said, stepping closer. The Orphan expected them to stop there, expected hesitation, wariness, some belated realization that interfering was pointless. But the human didn't falter. They moved with a casual sort of confidence, as if stepping between a helpless outcast and a far stronger foe was an everyday occurrence. Their gaze met the merchant's. "Let them go." Something unspoken passed between them. A silent contest of will. The merchant scoffed, shoving the Orphan backward. They stumbled but caught themselves before hitting the ground. The merchant turned away, muttering curses under his breath, and the crowd quickly lost interest. The Orphan did not know what to say. No one had ever intervened for them before. The human turned to them, expression shifting from sharp defiance to something softer. "You okay?" The Orphan stiffened. They did not understand this question. Did not understand why this stranger would care. The human exhaled through their nose, rubbing the back of their head. "You hungry?" The Orphan's mandibles twitched. Another question they did not know how to answer. The human didn't wait for one. Instead, they reached into a pouch at their hip and pulled out a small, rectangular bar, wrapped in dull foil. They unwrapped it with practiced ease and broke off a piece, holding it out. The Orphan hesitated. Food was never given freely. Not in this world. Still, hunger clawed at them, and caution warred with desperation. Slowly, they reached out, expecting the human to snatch it back, to laugh at their gullibility. But the moment never came. Their fingers brushed against warm, unarmored skin as they took the offered piece, retreating immediately, as if expecting punishment. None came. The food tasted strange. Rich, dense, filled with an energy their body was unaccustomed to. They chewed carefully, trying to decipher the taste, the texture. It was not unpleasant. The human grinned. Protein bar. Not exactly gourmet, but better than nothing. The orphan swallowed, unsure what to do with the warmth curling in their chest. This was not how interactions were supposed to go. The human crouched slightly to meet their gaze. Got a name? The orphan flinched, shrinking back on instinct. A name? They had none. The human seemed to realize their mistake, lips pressing into a thin line. Then, after a beat, they nodded to themselves. Okay, no name. That's fine. A pause. How about I call you something? Just so I don't have to keep saying hey you all the time. This was wrong. Names were given by elders, by family. Not by offworlders with too warm voices and too gentle hands. But there was no one else to give them one. The orphan's secondary arms twitched, betraying their uncertainty. The human's lips quirked slightly, as if that small movement was answer enough. They mused, glancing up at the sky. How about Soul? The orphan blinked. The human chuckled, running a hand through their dark hair. It's the name of the star my people come from. It suits you. It did not. It could not. And yet, the sound of it settled oddly in the orphan's chest, in a place they had never known could feel full. They had never been given anything before. The human stood, stretching slightly. Well, Soul, I should probably get going before I piss off any more locals. A grin, lopsided but warm. See you around? They did not wait for an answer. And yet, for the first time in their life, the orphan found themselves hoping someone would return. Soul had never been followed before. Not in the way the human did, without malice, without the looming threat of cruelty or punishment. Not with an expression that spoke of curiosity rather than disdain. Yet, day after day, the human returned to the market, lingering just long enough for Soul to notice before offering another small gift, a food ration, a spare piece of cloth against the evening chill, a quiet word of acknowledgement that felt heavier than it should have. Soul did not know what to make of them. At first, they kept their distance, waiting for the inevitable catch. Nothing in this world was freely given. But the human never asked for anything in return. They did not gloat. They did not demand obedience. They only smiled, spoke with easy confidence, and treated Soul as if they were worth speaking to. It was an unfamiliar weight, this strange kindness. One Soul did not know how to carry. Still, they found themselves drawn back, trailing in the human shadow, observing as they navigated the settlement with a sort of careless ease that should have gotten them killed. The Vareth were not a forgiving people, least of all to outsiders, yet the humans seemed unbothered by the sharp stares, the muttered words of derision. More than once, Soul caught sight of an enforcer watching too closely, of merchants whispering when they thought the human wasn't looking. The settlement did not trust them. And if they did not trust the human, then, by extension, they would trust Soul even less. They should have left. Should have let the human go their own way before they inevitably brought trouble down upon both of them. But they didn't. It was on the 5th day that Soul finally spoke first. Why? The word came rough, unpracticed. They did not use the trade tongue often, had never needed to before now. The human, seated on the edge of a supply crate, tilted their head. Why what? Soul hesitated. They had never been given the space to ask questions before, had never expected answers. Why are you doing this? The human exhaled, a slow sound that seemed to hold more weight than it should have. Because I want to. The response made no sense. No one did anything unless there was something to gain. The human must have seen the doubt in their posture, because they sighed and leaned forward, elbows resting on their knees. Look, Soul. I've seen a lot of places, met a lot of people. And you know what I've learned? A pause, waiting. Soul shook their head. That sometimes people just need someone to give a damn. The words settled heavily between them. Soul did not know what to say. They had spent their entire existence being reminded that no one gave a damn about them. They were a defect, a mistake, to be tolerated at best and discarded at worst. And yet, the human said it with such certainty, as if the idea of caring for someone without reason was as natural as breathing. Soul did not understand them. But for the first time they wanted to. They began to linger longer, responding in small, halting words rather than silence. The human never pushed, never pried. They filled the gaps with their own stories, tales of distant worlds, of sky cities that floated on water, of creatures made of shifting light and sound. Soul listened. They did not believe half of what they heard, but they listened. And then the trouble began. It started with whispers, the kind that slithered through the streets, growing sharper with each retelling. The human had been seen too often with the outcast. They had taken an interest. There were rules about such things. Soul knew they should leave before the rumors turned into something worse. But the thought of abandoning the only person who had ever looked at them without scorn felt like carving something vital from their own body. So they stayed. It was a mistake. The warning came in the form of a confrontation. 3 Varath, their carapaces polished to a dark sheen, their postures speaking of high caste and unquestioned strength. They did not look at Soul. Soul was not worth looking at. "You overstep, off-worlder," the leader said, voice carrying the cold weight of authority. "Your presence here was tolerated. It will not be if you continue down this path." The human crossed their arms. "And what path is that exactly?" A flicker of mandibles, the equivalent of a sneer. "You know well enough. This thing," a sharp, dismissive gesture toward Soul, as if they were nothing more than an insect to be brushed aside, "is not yours to claim." Something dark flickered across the human's face. It was gone in an instant, but Soul had seen it. A tightness around the jaw, a narrowing of the eyes. "I wasn't aware people could be claimed," the human said, voice deceptively light. "You will be made aware," the Varath said. "Leave them be. There will not be another warning." They left without another word. Soul waited for the human to turn to them, to demand an explanation, to ask why they had never mentioned that their continued association would lead to this. But the human only exhaled sharply, running a hand through their hair. "Well," they muttered, "that was subtle." Soul swallowed. "You should go." The human frowned. "What?" "You should go," Soul repeated, forcing the words through clenched mandibles. "They will not warn you again. They will kill you next time." A beat of silence. Then, "And what about you?" Soul faltered. "They won't stop just because I walk away," the human said. "You know that." Of course they knew that. They had always known their existence was tolerated only because they were beneath notice. Now they were something more dangerous, an anomaly, a disruption. They had drawn attention. And attention in their world was never good. The human watched them carefully, something unreadable in their expression. Then, as if coming to a decision, they said, "Come with me." Soul stared at them. "What?" "Come with me," the human repeated, voice steady. "Wherever it is you go after this. I'll make sure you're not alone." The words knocked the air from Soul's lungs. They had never been given a choice before, had never been offered anything but scorn, rejection, and the knowledge that they would die as they had lived, unwanted. And yet, here was this impossible human, standing before them, hand outstretched, offering something Soul had never dared to hope for. A future. Soul did not take their hand. Not yet. But they did not walk away. The settlement was no longer safe. Soul had known at the moment the enforcers arrived, their silent presence more damning than words. They did not need to speak their intent aloud. This was how warnings became consequences. If Soul had been alone, they might have accepted their fate. There had never been another path for them, not really. But now they were not alone. The human moved with careful efficiency, leading them through the narrow back alleys of the market, each step deliberate. Soul followed without hesitation, their legs aching to keep pace, their mind still struggling to grasp the enormity of what they were doing. They were running. No, worse, they were escaping. A lone outcast leaving the settlement was unremarkable. An off-worlder stealing away, one of their kind? That was a challenge to authority. It was a violation of unspoken laws, and the Varath did not forgive violations. Soul risked a glance behind them. Shadows moved between the structures, figures tracking their path with methodical intent. There was no doubt they were being hunted. The human's jaw tightened. They're faster than I thought. Sol's mandibles clicked in silent agreement. The Vareth were not just faster. They knew the terrain. Every tunnel, every hidden passage, every vantage point, it all belonged to them. There was no true escape, only a delaying of the inevitable. Unless... Sol hesitated. The human had done more for them than anyone ever had risked their own life without expectation. And yet, if Sol followed them now, it would not be the human's fight alone. They exhaled sharply, making their choice. This way. Surprise flickered across the human's face, but they didn't question it. Sol veered left, away from the designated travel paths, toward the lower districts, the parts of the settlement where oversight was thinner, where rules held less weight. It was dangerous, but that was the point. The structures here were older, worn down by time and neglect, the streets uneven beneath their feet. Faint bioluminescent markers flickered along the walls, casting eerie green glows over rusted metal and brittle chitin. The human kept close, their breathing steady but alert. Behind them, the pursuit did not falter. Sol clenched their secondary arms. The enforcers would not stop, not unless given a reason. Not unless the risk of continuing outweighed the reward of capture. A reckless thought surfaced unbidden. They could be that risk. The humans seemed to notice the shift in their posture, their steps slowing marginally. Sol. There's a route ahead, Sol interrupted, voice steady despite the tightness in their chest. It splits. You take the right path. I'll go left. The human's expression darkened. No. Sol swallowed. They want me, not you. That's not the point. It is, Sol pressed. They won't chase you if they think they already have what they want. The human exhaled, sharp and frustrated. You don't know that. I do, Sol said quietly. And so do you. The truth hung between them, heavy and undeniable. The human looked at them, really looked, and for a moment, Sol thought they would refuse. That they would argue, insist, try to protect them the way they had since the beginning. But then, something in their expression shifted. Not defeat, not surrender, but understanding. A beat passed. Then the human reached into their jacket, pulling free a small, thin device, pressing it into Sol's palm. Comms relay, they said. Encrypted. If you get clear, use it. I'll find you. Sol's fingers curled around it. A promise. No more words were needed. As they neared the split, Sol took one last glance at the human. Then they ran. Left, toward danger. Toward pursuit. Toward the inevitable. The footsteps behind them shifted, some splitting off to follow the human, but most remained on Sol's trail. Just as expected. The chase was brutal. The air burned in their lungs, their legs screaming with exertion. They ducked through half-collapsed tunnels, scaled rusted beams, took turns sharp enough to nearly send them sprawling. But they did not stop. Not until they reached the outer perimeter. Beyond it, the land stretched barren, jagged rock formations and deep fissures carved by long-dead rivers. No shelter. No cover. But it was not meant to be an escape route. It was a statement. Sol slowed, turning to face their pursuers. The enforcers emerged from the shadows, their movements unhurried now. They had won. Sol was trapped, alone, with nowhere left to run. One of them stepped forward, their chitin gleaming under the dim light. You should not have made this difficult. Sol's secondary arms twitched. I didn't. Before they could react, Sol crushed the device in their palm. A pulse of energy burst from it, a signal that would travel beyond the settlement, beyond the orbiting patrols. A distress beacon, crude but effective. The enforcers went rigid. Sol took a slow breath. You should leave, they said. The lead enforcer's mandibles flared. You think your off-worlder will come back for you? Sol did not answer. Because they already knew the truth. The human would come. And for the first time, Sol had something worth waiting for. The enforcers did not leave. Sol hadn't expected them to. The distress signal was a gamble, a desperate ploy to buy time, but the Vareth did not fear outsiders. They had ruled this place for generations, had dictated who lived, who served, and who was discarded. One stray human did not change that. The lead enforcer stepped forward, claws clicking against the stone. You think this will save you? Their voice was calm, almost amused. That an off-worlder will return for something as insignificant as you? Soul did not flinch. They had been called insignificant their entire life. The words no longer held power. But the enforcer was wrong. Because Soul knew the truth now, someone would come for them. Someone already had. They did not waste breath on an answer. The enforcer's mandibles twitched in irritation. A silent signal passed between them, and the others moved in, encircling Soul with precise, practiced steps. Not rushing. There was no need. Soul had nowhere to go. Cold resolve settled in their chest. If this was where it ended, they would make it cost something. The first strike came fast. Soul dodged, barely, but a second caught them across the ribs, sending a sharp bloom of pain through their side. They staggered, breath ragged, but remained standing. The enforcers were not trying to kill them. Not yet. A lesson had to be made first. A blow sent them to their knees, rough hands seizing their arms, holding them in place. The lead enforcer crouched before them. This is what happens to those who forget their place. Soul spat blood onto the ground between them. The enforcer's mandibles flared, a hand lifting to strike. And then the sky roared. The impact came first, a tremor through the earth, followed by the deafening wail of thrusters scorching atmosphere. The enforcers recoiled, mandibles clicking in shock as wind howled through the canyons, sending dust and debris scattering. Soul knew, before they even turned their head, what they would see. The human had come back. The ship, a rugged, battered thing that had clearly seen its share of battles, hovered just above the rocks, landing gear barely touching the surface. The ramp had already descended, and standing at its edge, framed against the glow of the engines, was the human. They were armed. Not with the primitive shock staves of the Varath enforcers, nor the delicate energy blades of the high-caste warriors, but with a weapon unmistakably human, blunt, brutal, and designed for the singular purpose of making things bleed. The lead enforcer recovered first. This is not your quarrel, off-worlder. The human did not lower their weapon. Yeah, see, that's where you're wrong. Their voice was steady, but Soul knew them well enough now to hear the controlled fury beneath it. The enforcers were not afraid. Not yet. The lead enforcer straightened, regaining composure. You do not belong here. You will leave. The human's jaw tightened. Not without them. They did not wait for permission. They moved faster than the enforcers expected, faster than Soul expected. A shot rang out, striking the ground inches from the enforcer's feet, forcing them back. The next shot found its mark, dropping one before they could react. Chaos erupted. Soul barely had time to throw themselves aside before the fight consumed the space around them. The human fought with the kind of efficiency that came from experience, from a life spent knowing exactly when to pull the trigger, when to move, when to break something that wouldn't get back up. The Varath had strength. They had numbers. But they had never fought a human before. Soul watched, dazed, as their captors fell one by one, thrown into disarray by an enemy that did not fight the way they expected. The human did not challenge them with posturing, did not wait for openings dictated by Varath tradition. They made their own. By the time the last enforcer fell, the air was thick with the scent of burned ozone and blood. Silence followed. The human exhaled, turning, eyes scanning the dust until they found Soul. For the first time, Soul saw something close to fear in their expression. The weapon was gone in an instant, cast aside as they strode forward, dropping to one knee before Soul, hands hovering uncertainly, searching for injury. Are you? I'm fine, Soul rasped. The human didn't look convinced. You're bleeding. Soul glanced at the smear of dark fluid along their side. It didn't matter. Not compared to what had just happened. The human shook their head, breath unsteady. Damn it, Soul. Soul blinked. You came back. The human stilled. Then, softer, as if the weight of it was only now settling upon them, they said, Of course I did. The words should not have meant anything. Should not have made something sharp press behind Soul's ribs, their hands clenching into the dust. Of course they did. No one had ever said such a thing to them before. They swallowed hard, pushing against the emotion clawing its way up their throat. We should go. The human nodded.
Yeah.
Soul moved to stand, only for the human to catch their arm, guiding them up with a care that felt wholly unfamiliar. The settlement lay behind them, silent now. It would not remain so for long. Soul knew what they were leaving behind, knew that they could never return. But as they followed the human up the ramp, into the ship that had descended from the sky like an act of defiance, they realized something. For the first time in their life, they were not running from something. They were running towards something. And for the first time, that was enough. The ship's interior was dimly lit, the hum of the engines steady beneath their feet. Soul had never been aboard a human vessel before. It smelled of metal and something distinctly unfamiliar, a mixture of sterilized air and old fabric. Everything was compact, designed for function over comfort, but it felt safe. Safer than anywhere they had ever been. The human guided them toward a seat in the corner of the small cabin, their touch light but firm. Sit, they ordered, voice tight. I need to check your injuries. Soul hesitated. I said I was fine. The human gave them a look. Yeah, well, I don't trust your definition of fine right now. There was no arguing with that. Soul sank onto the seat, mandibles twitching as they watched the human rummage through a storage compartment, pulling out a battered medical kit. Their movements were controlled, but the tension in their shoulders hadn't eased. You're angry, Soul noted. The human didn't look up. Not at you. That was a lie. Not an outright one. But there was something simmering beneath their words, something unresolved. The silence stretched as they crouched before Soul, carefully tearing away the fabric of their worn tunic to examine the wound. Their touch was warm, gentle, nothing like the careless roughness Soul had known all their life. They should have looked away, should have let the human work in silence. Instead, they said, you could have left. The human's hands stilled. Soul wasn't sure why they had spoken the words aloud. Perhaps part of them needed to hear the answer again. Needed confirmation that this wasn't some fleeting act of misguided kindness. The human let out a slow breath. I should have, they admitted. The words should have stung. But then the human looked at them, really looked, and the weight of those words shifted. But I wasn't going to, they added softly. Soul's chest tightened. They did not understand this. Did not understand why a human would risk themselves for someone like them, why they would choose to return when they had every opportunity to walk away. Why? Soul asked before they could stop themselves. The human's gaze didn't waver. Because you deserved better than that place. Simple words. A simple truth. And yet, it unraveled something deep inside Soul, something they had never dared to believe in. The human resumed their work, carefully applying a salve that burned before numbing the pain. Soul forced themselves to stay still, watching as their rescuer moved with focused determination. How bad is it? They asked. You'll live. A weak attempt at humor, but the tension hadn't entirely left the human's voice. You took a few bad hits, but nothing life-threatening. You're lucky. Soul huffed softly. I don't believe in luck. The human shot them a look. Then believe in me. Soul's mandibles parted slightly. They didn't know how to respond to that. The human finished wrapping the wound, securing the bandages with practiced efficiency. You'll need rest, they said. Food, too. I don't know what your diet looks like, but I've got some protein rations that might work. Soul blinked. No one had ever concerned themselves with such things before. They hesitated, then murmured, Thank you. The human paused, as if the words had caught them off guard. Then, after a beat, they nodded. Anytime. Soul wanted to believe that. The engines rumbled beneath them, a reminder that they were no longer bound to the settlement, no longer trapped under the weight of a life that had never truly belonged to them. They were free, but freedom was an unfamiliar thing, and with it came a question they had not considered. What happens now? The human sighed, running a hand through their hair. That depends. On what? The human studied them for a long moment. On what you want. Soul's throat tightened. No one had ever asked them that before. The weight of it settled heavily upon them, but beneath it, there was something else, something fragile but real.
Hope.
For the first time, their future was their own. And for the first time, they were not alone in it. Soul did not know what they wanted. The human had asked as if the answer should be obvious, as if the concept of choosing their own future was not foreign, not something so distant that it barely felt real. For so long, they had simply endured, surviving from one day to the next, never daring to think beyond the present. The idea of wanting something had never been a luxury afforded to them. Yet now, seated in the dim glow of the ship's cabin, the hum of the engines a steady presence beneath them, the weight of that question settled deep in their chest. The human had given them freedom. But what did one do with freedom when they had never known it before? The human, perhaps sensing the storm of thoughts raging inside them, sighed and leaned back against the opposite wall. "You don't have to decide right now," they said, voice quieter than before. "We got time."
Time.
Another thing Soul had never possessed in excess. They studied the human, this strange off-worlder who had risked their life for someone they barely knew, who had come back when no one else ever had. Soul still did not fully understand them, did not understand why they cared.
But they wanted to.
"Why did you come to the settlement in the first place?" they asked at last. The human exhaled, rubbing the back of their neck. "Salvage, mostly. I was supposed to trade for some parts, maybe pick up supplies." They huffed a quiet, humorless laugh. "Didn't exactly go as planned." Soul tilted their head. "So, you were not looking for me?" The human's brows furrowed.
No.
"But once I saw you," their jaw tightened. "Once I realized what was happening, I couldn't just walk away." Soul looked away. They did not know what to do with that truth, with the knowledge that their existence had mattered enough for someone to intervene. It was a fragile, unfamiliar thing, and it made something in their chest ache in ways they could not explain. The ship rumbled slightly as it adjusted course, the autopilot making subtle corrections. Soul glanced toward the small navigation panel, watching the unfamiliar star patterns shift against the black void beyond the viewport. "Where are we going?" they asked. The human followed their gaze. "Away from there," they answered simply. "Beyond that? I haven't decided yet." Soul frowned. "You do not have a home?" The human hesitated. "Not really." That surprised them. They had assumed that all humans had a place to return to, a world where they belonged. But perhaps the two of them were not so different after all. The thought settled strangely in their mind. Soul shifted, testing the ache in their ribs. The bandages held firm, the pain dull rather than sharp now. It was not the first time they had been injured, but it was the first time someone had treated their wounds with care rather than indifference. They curled their claws slightly, contemplating the sensation. "I do not know what to do now," they admitted. The words felt heavy, vulnerable, but the human did not mock them for it. Instead, they nodded. "That's okay," they said. "We'll figure it out."
We.
Soul's mandibles twitched slightly. There had never been a we before. The human pushed themselves to their feet, stretching. "You should rest," they said, nodding toward the small cot built into the wall. "You've been through a lot." Soul hesitated, but did not argue. They were exhausted, body aching from the events of the past day, but a lingering unease remained, a quiet fear that if they closed their eyes, this would all disappear, that they would wake to find themselves back in the settlement, alone once more. The human must have seen something in their expression because their voice softened. "I'll be here when you wake up." Soul swallowed hard. They did not respond, but after a long moment, they finally allowed themselves to relax, easing onto the cot. The ship hummed around them, a steady, constant presence. As their eyes drifted shut, a thought settled in their mind, gentle, uncertain, but undeniably real. Maybe for the first time, they had somewhere to belong. Soul woke to the steady hum of the ship and the distant clatter of movement. The unfamiliar sensation of waking without immediate fear or urgency left them momentarily disoriented. No harsh voices barked orders, no threat loomed over them, pressing them down. Just the quiet thrum of the vessel and the muffled sound of the human moving about. Their ribs ached, but the pain had dulled to something manageable. They shifted carefully, testing their limbs, the bandages holding firm. The ship felt safe. A strange word. A stranger feeling. Soul pushed themselves upright, mandibles twitching as they adjusted to their surroundings. The human sat at the small workstation, their back to Soul, focused on a screen filled with data Soul could not decipher. They were murmuring to themselves, something about fuel reserves and trade routes, but their posture was relaxed, unguarded. For a long moment, Soul simply watched them. They had seen many kinds of people in their life, cruel ones, indifferent ones, those who viewed them as little more than an inconvenience or a burden. But this human was something different. They had no reason to care, no obligation to help, and yet they had. Soul did not know what to do with that. The human turned then, glancing over their shoulder. "You're awake." Soul nodded. The human studied them for a moment before tilting their head toward the small storage compartment. "I set aside some food. Don't know if it'll sit well with you, but it's worth a try." Soul hesitated before swinging their legs over the side of the cot, moving stiffly, but with growing confidence. They crossed the small space, their movements cautious, and peered into the storage unit. A few ration packs sat there, neatly arranged. Soul reached for one, inspecting the contents. "You don't have to eat it if it's not compatible," the human added, watching them carefully. "We'll figure something out."
Again we.
Soul wasn't sure why that word carried such weight, but it did. They lowered themselves into the seat across from a human, claws careful, as they unwrapped the ration. The scent was foreign but not unpleasant. Tentatively, they took a small bite. The texture was odd, the taste bland, but it did not repel them. The human smirked slightly. "Not great, huh?" Soul flicked their mandibles. "Edible." That's the best anyone's ever said about those things. The corner of Soul's mouth twitched, an unfamiliar gesture, something instinctive rather than intentional. The human leaned back, arms crossing loosely over their chest. "So," they said, voice casual but laced with something deeper. "What now?" Soul stilled. The question had been inevitable, but it still unsettled them. They swallowed the bite of food, setting the rest aside. "I do not know." The human nodded, as if they had expected that. "You don't have to decide right away," they said. "But if you want, you can stay. At least until you figure things out." Soul's claws curled slightly against the edge of the table.
Stay.
The idea should have frightened them. Should have felt like another cage, another temporary kindness that would eventually be stripped away. But it didn't. The human was not asking out of pity. They were not demanding anything in return. They were simply offering. For the first time, the choice was theirs. Soul met the human's gaze, searching for deception, for some hidden catch. But there was none. After a long pause, they gave a small, careful nod. The human's lips quirked upward. Not a triumphant smile, not the gloating expression Soul had seen on those who thought they had won something. Just quiet acknowledgement. "All right then," they said, standing. "Welcome aboard." Soul exhaled slowly. For the first time in their life, they had chosen their own future. And for the first time, it felt like a future worth having.